Animals such as wolves and chimpanzees live in a dual reality. On the one hand, they are familiar with objective entities outside them, such as trees, rocks and rivers. On the other hand, they are aware of subjective experiences within them, such as fear, joy and desire. Sapiens, in contrast, live in triple-layered reality. In addition to trees, rivers, fears and desires, the sapiens world also contains stories about money, gods, nations and corporations. As history unfolded, the impact of gods, nations and corporations grew at the expense of rivers, fears and desires. There are still many rivers in the world, and people are still motivated by their fears and wishes, but Jesus Christ, the French Republic and Apple Inc. have dammed and harnessed the rivers, and have learned to shape our deepest anxieties and yearnings. Since new 21st century technologies are likely to make such fictions only more potent, understanding our future requires understanding how stories about Christ, France and Apple have gained so much power. Humans think they make history, but history actually revolves around the web of stories. The basic abilities of individual humans have not changed much since the Stone Age. But the web of stories has grown from strength to strength, thereby pushing history from the Stone Age to the Silicon Age. It all began about 70,000 years ago, when the cognitive revolution enabled sapiens to start talking about things that existed only in their own imagination. For the following 60,000 years sapiens wove many fictional webs, but these remained small and local. The spirit of a revered ancestor worshipped by one tribe was completely unknown to its neighbors, and seashells valuable in one locality became worthless once you crossed the nearby mountain range. Stories about ancestral spirits and precious seashells still gave sapiens a huge advantage, because they allowed hundreds and sometimes even thousands of sapiens to cooperate effectively, which was far more than Neanderthals or chimpanzees could do. Yet as long as sapiens remained hunter-gatherers, they could not cooperate on a truly massive scale, because it was impossible to feed a city or a kingdom by hunting and gathering. Consequently, the spirits, fairies and demons of the Stone Age were relatively weak entities. The agricultural revolution, which began about 12,000 years ago, provided the necessary material base for enlarging and strengthening the intersubjective networks. Farming made it possible to feed thousands of people in crowded cities and thousands of soldiers in disciplined armies. However, the intersubjective webs then encountered a new obstacle. In order to preserve the collective myths and organize mass cooperation, the early farmers relied on the data processing abilities of the human brain, which was strictly limited. Farmers believed in stories about great gods. They built temples to their favorite god, held festivals in his honor, offered him sacrifices, and gave him lands, tithes and presents. In the first cities of ancient Sumer, about 6,000 years ago, the temples were not just centers of worship, but also the most important political and economic hubs. The Sumerian gods fulfilled a function analogous to modern brands and corporations. Today, corporations are fictional legal entities that own property, lend money, hire employees and initiate economic enterprises. In ancient Uruk, Lagash and Shuruppak, the gods functioned as legal entities that could own fields and slaves, give and receive loans, pay salaries and build dams and canals. Since the gods never died, and since they had no children to fight over their inheritance, they gathered more and more property and power. An increasing number of Sumerians found themselves employed by the gods, taking loans from the gods, tilling the gods' lands and owing taxes and tithes to the gods. Just as in present-day San Francisco John is employed by Google while Mary works for Microsoft, so in ancient Uruk one person was employed by the great god Enki while his neighbor worked for the goddess Inanna. The temples of Enki and Inanna dominated the Uruk skyline, and their divine logos branded buildings, products and clothes. For the Sumerians, Enki and Inanna were as real as Google and Microsoft are real for us. Compared to their predecessors, the ghosts and spirits of the Stone Age, the Sumerian gods were very powerful entities. It goes without saying that the gods didn't actually run their businesses, for the simple reason that they didn't exist anywhere except in the human imagination. Day-to-day activities were managed by the temple priests, just as Google and Microsoft need to hire flesh and blood humans to manage their affairs. However, as the gods acquired more and more property and power, the priests could not cope. They may have represented the mighty sky god or the all-knowing earth goddess, but they themselves were fallible mortals. They had difficulty remembering all the lands belonging to the goddess Inanna, which of Inanna's employees had received their salary already, which of the goddess's tenants had failed to pay rent and what interest rate the goddess charged her debtors. This was one of the main reasons why in Sumer, like everywhere else around the world, human cooperation networks could not grow much even thousands of years after the agricultural revolution. There were no huge kingdoms, no extensive trade networks and no universal religions. This obstacle was finally removed about 5,000 years ago, when the Sumerians invented both writing and money. These Siamese twins, born to the same parents at the same time and in the same place, broke the data processing limitations of the human brain. Writing and money made it possible to start collecting taxes from hundreds of thousands of people, to organize complex bureaucracies and to establish vast kingdoms. In Sumer, these kingdoms were managed in the name of the gods by human priest kings. In the neighboring Nile Valley, people went a step further, merging the priest king with the god to create a living deity, Pharaoh. The Egyptians considered Pharaoh to be an actual god rather than just a divine deputy. The whole of Egypt belonged to that god, and all people had to obey his orders and pay his taxes. Just as in the Sumerian temples, so also in pharaonic Egypt the god didn't manage his business empire by himself. Some pharaohs ruled with an iron fist, while others passed their days at banquets and festivities, but in both cases the practical work of administering Egypt was left to thousands of literate officials. Just like any other human, Pharaoh had a biological body with biological needs, desires and emotions. But the biological Pharaoh was of little importance. The real ruler of the Nile Valley was an imagined Pharaoh that existed in the stories millions of Egyptians told one another. While Pharaoh sat in his palace in the capital city of Memphis, eating grapes and dallying with his wives and mistresses, Pharaoh's officials crisscrossed the kingdom from the Mediterranean shore to the Nubian desert. The bureaucrats calculated the taxes each village had to pay, wrote them on long papyrus scrolls and sent them to Memphis. When a written order came from Memphis to recruit soldiers to the army or laborers for some construction project, the officials gathered the necessary men. They computed how many kilograms of wheat the royal granaries contained, how many work days were required to clean the canals and reservoirs, and how many ducks and pigs to send to Memphis, so that Pharaoh's harem could dine well. Even when the living deity died, and his body was embalmed and borne in an extravagant funerary procession to the royal necropolis outside Memphis, the bureaucracy kept going. The officials kept writing scrolls, collecting taxes, sending orders and oiling the gears of the pharaonic machine. If the Sumerian gods remind us of present-day company brands, so the living god Pharaoh can be compared to modern personal brands such as Elvis Presley, Madonna or Justin Bieber. Just like Pharaoh, Elvis too had a biological body, complete with biological needs, desires and emotions. Elvis ate and drank and slept. Yet Elvis was much more than a biological body. Like Pharaoh, Elvis was a story, a myth, a brand, and the brand was far more important than the biological body. During Elvis's lifetime, the brand earned millions of dollars selling records, tickets, posters and rights, but only a small fraction of the necessary work was done by Elvis in person. Instead, most of it was done by a small army of agents, lawyers, producers and secretaries. Consequently, when the biological Elvis died, for the brand it was business as usual. Even today fans still buy the King's posters and albums, radio stations go on paying royalties, and more than 500,000 pilgrims flock each year to Graceland, the King's necropolis in Memphis, Tennessee. Prior to the invention of writing, stories were confined by the limited capacity of human brains. You couldn't invent overly complex stories which people couldn't remember. With writing you could suddenly create extremely long and intricate stories, which were stored on tablets and papyri rather than in human heads. No ancient Egyptian remembered all of Pharaoh's lands, taxes and tithes. Elvis Presley never even read all the contracts signed in his name. No living soul is familiar with all the laws and regulations of the European Union, and no banker or Kia agent tracks down every dollar in the world. Yet all of these minutiae are written somewhere, and the assemblage of relevant documents defines the identity and power of Pharaoh, Elvis, the EU and the dollar. Writing has thus enabled humans to organize entire societies in an algorithmic fashion. We encountered the term algorithm when we tried to understand what emotions are and how brains function, and defined it as a methodical set of steps that can be used to make calculations, resolve problems and reach decisions. In illiterate societies, people make all calculations and decisions in their heads. In literate societies, people are organized into networks, so that each person is only a small step in a huge algorithm, and it is the algorithm as a whole that makes the important decisions. This is the essence of bureaucracy. Think about a modern hospital, for example. When you arrive, the receptionist hands you a standard form and asks you a predetermined set of questions. Your answers are forwarded to a nurse, who compares them with the hospital's regulations in order to decide what preliminary tests to give you. She then measures, say, your blood pressure and heart rate, and takes a blood test. The doctor on duty examines the results, and follows a strict protocol to decide in which ward to hospitalize you. In the ward, you are subjected to much more thorough examinations, such as an X-ray or an fMRI scan, mandated by thick medical guidebooks. Specialists then analyze the results according to well-known statistical databases, deciding what medicines to give you or what further tests to run. This algorithmic structure ensures that it doesn't really matter who is the receptionist, nurse or doctor on duty. Their personality type, their political opinions and their momentary moods are irrelevant. As long as they all follow the regulations and protocols, they have a good chance of curing you. According to the algorithmic ideal, your fate is in the hands of the system, and not in the hands of the flesh and blood mortals who happen to man this or that post. What's true of hospitals is also true of armies, prisons, schools, corporations, and ancient kingdoms. Of course, ancient Egypt was far less technologically sophisticated than a modern hospital, but the algorithmic principle was the same. In ancient Egypt too, most decisions were made not by a single wise person, but by a network of officials linked together through papyri and stone inscriptions. Acting in the name of the living god Pharaoh, the network restructured human society and reshaped the natural world. For example, Pharaoh Senusret III and his son Amenemhat III, who ruled Egypt from 1878 BC to 1814 BC, dug a huge canal linking the Nile to the swamps of the Fame Valley. An intricate system of dams, reservoirs and subsidiary canals diverted some of the Nile waters to Fame, creating an immense artificial lake holding 50 billion cubic meters of water. 1 By comparison, Lake Mead, the largest man-made reservoir in the United States formed by the Hoover Dam, holds at most 35 billion cubic meters of water. The Fame engineering project gave Pharaoh the power to regulate the Nile, prevent destructive floods and provide precious water relief in times of drought. In addition, it turned the Fame Valley from a crocodile-infested swamp surrounded by barren desert into Egypt's granary. A new city called Shadit was built on the shore of the new artificial lake. The Greeks called it Crocodilopolis, the city of crocodiles. It was dominated by the temple of the crocodile god Sobek, who was identified with Pharaoh. Contemporary statues sometimes show Pharaoh sporting a crocodile head. The temple housed a sacred crocodile called Petsuchos, who was considered the living incarnation of Sobek. Just like the living god Pharaoh, the living god Petsuchos was lovingly groomed by the attending priests, who provided the lucky reptile with lavish food and even toys, and dressed him up in gold cloaks and gem-encrusted crowns. After all, Petsuchos was the priest's brand, and their authority and livelihood depended on him. When Petsuchos died, a new crocodile was immediately elected to fill his sandals, while the dead reptile was carefully embalmed and mummified. In the days of Senusret III and Amenemhat III, the Egyptians had neither bulldozers nor dynamite. They didn't even have iron tools, workhorses or wheels. The wheel did not enter common usage in Egypt until about 1500 BC. Bronze tools were considered cutting-edge technology, but they were so expensive and rare that most of the building work was done only with tools made of stone and wood, operated by human muscle power. Many people argue that the great building projects of ancient Egypt, all the dams and reservoirs and pyramids, must have been built by aliens from outer space. How else could a culture lacking even wheels and iron accomplish such wonders? The truth is very different. Egyptians built Lake Fame and the pyramids not thanks to extraterrestrial help, but thanks to superb organizational skills. Relying on thousands of literate bureaucrats, Pharaoh recruited tens of thousands of laborers and enough food to maintain them for years on end. When tens of thousands of laborers cooperate for several decades, they can build an artificial lake or a pyramid even with stone tools. Pharaoh himself hardly lifted a finger, of course. He didn't collect taxes himself, he didn't draw any architectural plans, and he certainly never picked up a shovel. But the Egyptians believed that only prayers to the living god Pharaoh and to his heavenly patron Sobek could save the Nile Valley from devastating floods and droughts. They were right. Pharaoh and Sobek were imaginary entities that did nothing to raise or lower the Nile water level, but when millions of people believed in Pharaoh and Sobek and therefore cooperated to build dams and dig canals, floods and droughts became rare. Compared to the Sumerian gods, not to mention the Stone Age spirits, the gods of ancient Egypt were truly powerful entities that founded cities, raised armies and controlled the lives of millions of humans, cows and crocodiles. It may sound strange to credit imaginary entities with building or controlling things. But nowadays we habitually say that the United States built the first nuclear bomb, that China built the Three Gorges Dam, or that Google is building an autonomous car. Why not say, then, that Pharaoh built a reservoir and Sobek dug a canal?